Thanks everyone for joining today's first launch of the Information Dive, formerly known as iDive. Our goal is to bridge the knowledge gap between students and industry professionals by engaging in some meaningful conversations with you all here today. Our questions come from students seeking to learn more about how would one go about making the transition from post-grad as seamless as possible. Today, we have three guests from the UX industry: Olivia, who's a former digital design strategy manager at RBC and a newly joined PhD candidate at the Faculty of Information; Gavin, a recent grad and design researcher at RBC; and Marvin, who has formerly worked for Microsoft and currently at Facebook as a UX mixed methods researcher. We thank you kindly for your support and your time in helping our students learn from your stories and reflections. This episode will be one of a two-part special for all about UX. With a warm welcome, could I ask you all to give a brief intro about yourselves and how you got started in the UX space? Let's start with Olivia.
My name is Olivia Doggett, and I'm a designer and researcher currently pursuing my PhD at the iSchool. I'm just starting out, but my research is going to focus on designing for communities at the margins of technology. My work is at the intersection of emerging technologies, material practices, and critical design. I also have 4 years of experience working as both a product designer and design researcher and strategist for RBC in both their wealth management and digital divisions.
Cool, I guess I'll go next. My name is Gavin, and as mentioned, I'm a design researcher at RBC. I formerly worked at Rogers and also TribalScale. I actually come from a background originally where I worked previously as a research analyst for a company in the UK called IHS Markit, or formerly known as IHS Janes. So if you ever heard about where tanks are on the border, or about military reports in that kind of regard, that's kind of what I used to do. No, I don't have any secrets that I have to tell you right now in terms of military secrets. So yeah, but in that regard, I work as a design researcher at RBC. I'm focused on the channel where for browsing, for mobile browsers, and also for desktop usage of users just coming in and making their payments, looking at their account summaries, so their day-to-day kind of banking in that regard. That's mostly my background.
Hi, I am Marvin. I'm currently a UX researcher at Facebook. Before I was at Microsoft, primarily looking into the AR/VR space. I started at Microsoft with the HoloLens, looking at the military applications of the HoloLens, and then now currently at Facebook, I'm part of the Facebook Reality Lab. So it's basically a research and development arm, part of the Oculus and Facebook side of things. But I come from a background of human factors. Originally, actually, I was teaching musician in the Florida area, and then I changed careers and jumped into human factors, and I've ever since, it's all history since then. So yeah.
There's like this lovely triangle where Gavin has the military side that connects to Marvin, and then Marvin's in human factors connects to Olivia's PhD. So that is so cool how you guys all connect to each other. I'm going to ask you guys what you are responsible for your work in your current role or your past roles. If you guys want to expand a little bit on your intros or talk about a project that you like to walk, that you like.
I'll touch on a past project, just because of Facebook proprietary knowledge. I can't really touch into it, but I guess some of what's already out there, a lot of the projects are basically human factors literature based, that such as at HoloLens, it's a lot of like looking into like situational awareness, how people decide, and so it's very like combinational of like how a device would be used, and applying that literature, like what is the cognitive literature saying, and how can we predict how this device will be used. It's revolves around a lot of that. A lot of it is primarily generating like insights, recommendations based on what the literature says, which is one whole aspect to that. But then another is also like running those usability tests and seeing if it sticks, like basically this like what I mentioned earlier, like is testing out those recommendations from the literature, seeing if it sticks, if it works, if that's what people are doing with the equipment. But yeah, that's one of the biggest ones, I guess.
I can touch on a project that I did while at RBC because I think that makes more sense. Probably the one that would work the best for similar NDA reasons, as Marvin mentioned, is one that my team worked on summer 2019 on financial wellness. So it was a larger scale qualitative research project where we were looking into what are the barriers for Canadians on their path to financial wellness. So it was a qualitative project that involved interviews and online diaries of Canadians across the country. For participant recruitment, we really looked into how each participant was feeling in terms of their financial safety and confidence, and that was a big aspect of the recruitment process. So from a research design perspective, it was pretty interesting to do. We included about 60 Canadians across the country for interviews and online diaries, and we did a lot of interviews with advisors as well. The output of that was that we created an insights deck that also had some competitive analyses of like different comparable products that existed in market, that those insights were not directly serving one particular product, but were later funneled into other strategy decks that related to topics around things like trust and connectivity. And it was really eye-opening to just do something on financial wellness to really see what the barriers were for people out there, particularly within a digital setting.
Cool. So I guess it's my turn. Related to RBC as well, I'll try to skirt along the NDA routes as well. We worked recently on a project relating to payment strategy, and actually those some of your insights in regards to financial wellness, Olivia. And that related basically essentially along two lines: understanding how RBC clients make payments, or in that regard, also in regards to how they make transfers in terms of, say, an e-transfer, sending to friends or family. This was eventually, the outcome of this was through interviews, and communicated into a journey map. So we then overlaid the step-by-step process in terms of how our users would make an e-transfer or payment, and then we overlaid in terms of the actual user actions they would have to take through, and then we overlaid the data insights on top of that. This was eventually disseminated to a lot of the product owners and some of the senior management. In terms of how it's being used right now, the outcome, that's currently classified, so yeah.
I hear there's a lot of top secret in this conversation. So I'm going to kind of flip this question. I know you guys are talking about interviewing users. Let's look at how students would interview for a UX role. So what would you say to a student who's looking to go for a UX position, just kind of reflecting on your own UX interview experiences? What kind of questions should they expect, and how should they approach a UX interview? I'm going to give this to Gavin to go first, because I know he just ended, so we're going to go back down a different circle.
Cool. Yeah, so I think the one really interesting question for me when I graduated was, I originally trained at the iSchool kind of as a designer, but I also come from a background of research. And at one point, I really seriously considered going to academia as well. So, kudos to Olivia. And for me, it was, do I want to become a researcher? Do I want to become a designer? And at one point, I had this split kind of decision where it's like, I'm just going to say both of them in my profile. I'm like, both a designer and both a researcher. But after talking to like a lot of friends and even like my mentor, eventually I decided that, I was given the advice, it's actually better for you to specialize and choose one. Maybe, Olivia and Marvin, you have different experiences based off of that. But my experience was, it's better for me to say, I'm going to specialize in one and kind of be focused on that. And the feeling that I've been told was, if you say you're going to do both, it doesn't feel like you're specialized or dedicated to doing one of that. And so you can't really, you're more like a jack of all trades, but you need to specify what you're passionate about, and your skills need to focus and reflect that, especially in your resume and how you talk about that in your interviews. So that was one really big lesson for me in terms of, jumping to the field. And it was a question that I had to continually combat. I literally actually would recycle my resume, my portfolio, researcher, designer, both. And I was like, okay, screw it. I'm just going to go all the way for researcher. If I don't get it, I don't care. I'm trying to do just being a researcher. And it's funny because I think a lot of us may go into the field thinking, there's so many more designer jobs than there are user researcher jobs. But if your heart's not in it, you have to take that leap if you really want to do it. And if you don't take that leap, you'll never know, right? So that's kind of my thing.
I might touch some of what I agree with a lot of what you said, Gavin, and it reminds me of something I was mentioning earlier in a class that actually Roshni was in recently, which was like, I think it's good to specialize, but what's interesting is I think it also depends on the size of organization. So I think with larger organizations, the job description often is like very narrow. So if you're doing research, you're really responsible for research activities and you're expected to have like a very in-depth knowledge in those areas. Versus if you were to go to a smaller company, say like a mid-sized startup, then you might be expected to have a wider breadth of roles. So that's where you might be expected to do both the research as well as the design for whatever product that you're supporting. So for interviewing, I would be mindful of the size of company that you're going into, as well as the maturity of the design practice that exists there, because that will really determine how much you'll actually be doing and what you're expected to be doing. Some really specialized roles will be looking for CVs that are like extremely research or design oriented, of like, multiple methods, you have proof of doing that. Some might look for higher level ability because they need more of a jack of all trades. Another thing I think that's important for interviewing, particularly for design roles, is to be wary of how quickly they want to see your portfolio and the types of questions they ask for your portfolio. So if they're not interested in the process that you took to get to a final output and they only want to see your end visuals, so your medium high fidelity prototypes, whatever you're making, then that can often be an indication that that's what their expectation is for you to be doing. You might not be so involved in the process leading up to the creation of those materials. I've experienced that in the past, and it's something to be mindful of because my expertise was not within UI, but I was in a position where I really had to perform on that and was given very little context around the specific decisions of why something was going to be designed a certain way.
Yeah, I do agree with both Gavin and Olivia in the sense of one, yes, you kind of do have to, I guess, brand yourself as you specialize in one. But I know like for me, I've always still considered myself a designer, even though I'm still a researcher. But that's just because of, even though I studied human factors, I also went through a design boot camp as well. And as a researcher, you still have to communicate design findings or communicate like specific nuanced differences across iterations and be able to talk to those and collaborate with designers. So I know it's kind of like a debate whether you should focus on one, but from my experience, yes, I did find success that way, focusing on one. So, but I guess that's just cultural thing right now as how we are hired in this field, that you must fall in this box as a researcher or designer. But really, what we're doing is we're both. It just depends on how you look at it. But I definitely agree. As a branding, from a branding perspective, yeah, focusing on showcasing that you're a researcher kind of shows how serious you are as a researcher, or if you're a designer, it just shows how you're serious to that. So it might just be a perspective thing with what branding is, period. But yeah.
I actually have a follow-up question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Marvin and Gavin, do you feel that way even in a smaller organization? As in, like, do you feel you have to brand yourself so strong? Say you were to apply for like a smaller startup or something like that, do you think you would have to brand yourself that narrowly, or is it because you're at such large organizations?
As for me, I mean, I'm part of a large organization, and it's funny, kind of like you mentioned, that even with larger organization, there's also like mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative, and like all these like nuanced researcher levels. So at a startup, I I feel like, yes, unfortunately, you have to wear so many hats, and it is kind of like, at least what I've noticed is a hot debate whether why should researchers have to design as well. But to be a devil's advocate, if it's a startup, I mean, that's just an opportunity to apply those theories and just put it in design that you've grabbed over the years of experience. But yeah, that was a long way of answering the question. I do feel like you do have to brand yourself. Like, you can be a jack of all trades at a startup level, for sure.
It's funny because, yeah, you kind of answered a bit of the question of what I wanted to say, both you and Olivia and Marvin, and that is, I did mention the part that is, when I joined RBC, they asked me this question, is, why do you think you're called a design researcher and not a user experience researcher? And I was like, because I work with designers. I'm a designer. And he's like, partly yes, but partly also because if we just call it user experience, you'd only be doing user experience. And so if we call it design, then you're thinking of like things related to design in terms of solving the problem as a whole. And so I think a lot of the time it's true. It's like, we think of pigeonholing ourselves, siloing ourselves and saying like, yeah, we only do research, or yeah, I only do design. But really, like, we're really trying to solve problems with regards to digital solutions that we have in the day-to-day things that we do right now. So it's like good to take, and I agree in the sense of like, yeah, we have to brand ourselves, but in the practical day-to-day application of what we do, there is no, I only do this one thing and I only do that one thing. And I think that's also partly why I love the work that we do, which is, we think about things from an empathic level as well. But as researchers, we appreciate how other designers work. I want to understand what they're doing. They understand what I'm doing. I feel like it's the best way for us to work because we get stronger, I think, in that way, especially from a collaborative kind of viewpoint and approach. But yeah, I also agree that if we're at a lower level organization, then maybe it's better for us to be able to have those wide hats, to be able to function in many different ways and to be collaborative in that sense. But ultimately, I think it really depends, like, what is the work that we're supposed to do? What is the role that we're at? What is the company that we're serving for? And one last interesting point for me, I actually had a debate with a fellow researcher of mine, and that is, are we just researchers or should we just be designers, or are we designers also? And my friend was like, we are specifically researchers. We should just be researchers. We just focus on just doing that. And I had this really long debate about him. I was like, why can't we be both? Why can't we help and coordinate and be collaborative with them? And part of his opinion was that if we were both, if we were just helping us designers, then we'd kind of be diluting our craft a little bit. And so there's a bit of that was really interesting. So yeah, just thought I'd play the devil's advocate there.
Thanks so much for asking that question, Olivia. It's really interesting because, like, as a student, I can tell you in our UX program, we kind of come out as unicorns, and I don't really know how to brand myself except for based on my interests. So it's nice to know that there's a way you can play with all your hats, but also specialize in terms of what you want to do and what is known to you. Thank you for that. As UX is known to be a highly collaborative role, kind of touching upon what you guys have been saying, what are some tips you have for building rapport with colleagues in the office?
For building rapport, so I guess for some tips is it I guess like if I were to in layman's terms put it, always set expectations. And what I mean by that is when you collaborate with any stakeholder, especially cross-functionally, that do not understand how what UX research may be, it's usually best to like go in and gather like as many of the questions that they may have that they want answered or that you may have, or and just follow them through the process. That way you can actually interject, okay, these are the expectations of this. So like this protocol took this long, it will take this X amount of time to execute. And for the analysis side, it'll take maybe a week at least to run the analysis and give a deliverable that what is ultimately the goal. But if they're brought in through that whole process, you actually build that rapport where they trust you, and they start, especially if you're new, where they don't know what your skill sets are or your background. So you start building that rapport that you're there to help them in a way. And just constant being communication or updates if they can't be at every session that you hold openly or whatnot. But yeah, overall, it's just setting expectations is at least what's worked for me in the past.
Awesome. I love how you touched upon kind of asking questions and taking initiative. Seems to be like a really strong suit to building rapport with your colleagues, because you really want to be able to know what their needs and demands are, but then how you can best cater to them. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's a good tip, and I'll definitely keep that in mind. Gavin, what do you have to say?
I would give the researcher question, which is, maybe like in terms of like contextual inquiry, I'd ask them, what is it you're doing? Why do you do it the way you do? Can you explain to me from like, an apprentice to master method in terms of like, what's your approach? What are you trying to accomplish? How can I help you? What can I learn from the process? That's one way. In terms of like understanding from an empathic level of what they're doing. I'd also think about how to communicate to them, like communicating to different types of stakeholders. Are they designers? Are they non-design stakeholders? Kind of almost catering your communication to that level, people who you're trying to work with. I think those would be the two things that I would focus on in terms of rapport.
So for colleagues, that means people that are on the same level as in your team. Is that right, Roshni?
It could work with colleagues, and as they've been mentioning, kind of like cross stakeholders. So whoever you work with in the office, how do you kind of build that trust with them?
Right. I would say from a colleague perspective, one thing that really did resonate with me is, especially for people that are sitting around you, it is good to say hello to those people when you're starting. Because if you don't, then that's extremely awkward 3 months in when you realize that you're sitting beside that person every day. It's not easy to just go up and introduce yourself at that point. Gavin did a very good job at introducing himself when he first arrived at RBC. I remembered him very soon upon arrival. So Gavin, props to you. You really made a good first impression when you arrived. I think that's super important. From a stakeholder perspective, I would say setting expectations, as we mentioned, that's super important. I think it's also good to think of what your stakeholders want to be seeing and lead with that. People don't often care about the process of how you got to a certain place, particularly given that you've been hired as an expert. So if you're brought in to report on results from a research project that you've done, start with the information that's the most important and relevant to them, rather than like the process around how you've actually done something. The other thing with cross collaboration team or cross functional teams is you're all coming in with different perspectives, and you often value whatever you're representing as the most valuable aspect of the project. So if you're in business, coming from a business perspective, you really want to make sure that whatever aspect of business is being advocated for the design, as well as operations, design, whatever. So I think understanding what hills to die on versus not die on is super important, because you cannot win everything that you want. And if you develop a reputation for giving a hissy fit when things aren't going exactly the way you want, that's not a good thing. So really like think about it, like if you have 2 hills to die on a year, is this going to be the one that you're really going to put your foot down?
I think that brings such a great point to advocating for your research. Like, how do you kind of find that fine-tuned balance between advocating for your research and for what you've been doing with your work, but then also knowing kind of when it's time to take a step down and know what's the difference? How would you guys go about advocating for your research?
I was going to add something, and that is one thing about that, and what we've been talking about is also in terms of rapport and just advocating for research is make them part of your research. So for example, I have one story, which is we were doing a study and we had to, at the end, showcase it to different stakeholders. Specifically, there were actually 2 director level meetings. And the first meeting went pretty well. And most directors kind of nod their heads, they're accepting of the research. The second one did not. And the reason it did not go well was the one director who was present was not present in some of the research that we had involved them in. So for example, we did like usability studies for this research, and we had invited all the other directors, and they had actually come in and been part of those sessions. So they kind of already knew what the problems were. And when we delivered the results, we're like, oh yeah, this is new. This is not new. We already know this. Thank you for stating that. They were behind it. It really had their backing. It wasn't a surprise. And the one director who wasn't invited, who came in, she was like, what is this? And to her, it was almost, to them, it was almost like, I don't know what this is. The person almost saw it as a threat. And partly that was, maybe on our part for not inviting that person and being made part of the discussion. And partly because, maybe we didn't communicate to that person beforehand, this is what would be the results of that kind of result. And so giving that person, I think, beforehand that chance and making them being part of involved would have helped a lot. Would have helped build the rapport, would have helped allow us to kind of build a case for the results that we had and what we would go forward with next in terms of, what hill to die on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because if they're not a part of the process, they also won't see it for themselves. I mean, that's also part of the I guess the idea of play testing as well in gaming environments as well. So it's kind of like everyone is pitching in and they can see it right there in the moment live, what's happening. But I mean, that's at least one thing that we do at Facebook as well, is the play testing, just to test it live in front of everybody, and everybody gives feedback, and we just just synthesize it in that format. But cross-functional stakeholders just being part of that environment at the same time and being able to see everything live and happen, they can see where we come from. It's not like, oh, we've got all these implicit biases. It's actually there. And I've also run into a similar situation back a few years ago when I was at Lending Tree, where basically it's a hard lesson I learned early on was you can't do research in a closet away without no one knowing what you're coming up with, because if you come up with an idea or something and no one's seen the path of you getting there along the process, like Gavin perfectly said, they're going to take it right and like, oh, you're proposing a feature that might fall on their space, but they haven't even seen what led to the fruition of that idea. So, but yeah, I completely agree with Gavin.
Yeah, to add on that, because I also agree with both of you, so it's perfect, is that I think it's really important to understand the assumptions of your stakeholders going into a project. So what do they think is the outcome of the research that you're going to be doing? Because their assumptions are things often that they want to be true, because they're trying to make a case to be able to build something or go forward with a certain aspect of product development. And if you're not so sure that those assumptions are going to be met in the way that they think they are, you have to be very careful and strategic around how first of all, you're giving them roles. So like, what kind of jobs are they playing, and how you're actually exposing them to your findings. Is it bringing them along to interviews, or if they can't do that, getting them to listen in through a phone interview, or is it live playback of some of the findings that you get as they come in? But really keeping the stakeholders abreast of what the results are, I think, is really critical, especially if you think that there's going to be some results that are really going to mess with what they're hoping to be doing.
Yeah, I actually had one manager say, you're essentially telling your stakeholders sometimes that their baby is ugly. So that might come off pretty harshly to them. So it's true. Like, that's essentially our job as researchers. Sometimes we're going to tell them that, and we need to provide the evidence and the proof, especially if it's a very hard pill to swallow for them.
And yeah, I'm just going to also add to the point of, like, I think you touched on this a little bit, Olivia, and that is knowing we shall die on, but also kind of like, what's the narrative that's being told? What's the outcome of this? And sometimes, and I remember reading this in a book and thinking like, that'll never happen, but that is, research can also be purposed for different reasons. The people who, obviously we want to hope the best that's going to be coming out of this, but sometimes we do have biases, or we have beliefs that, or intentions with regard to how that research will be used. The one thing that we all are and should be cognizant of is that research should not be used for purposes that are non-research, in terms of it being used for political purpose or being used for a different purpose other than what we think it. And so for us, I feel like, for me, especially the researcher, we have to be very cognizant and very careful that our research is being seen as neutral. And if we ever lose a cloak of neutrality, that's going to compromise our entire credibility in all the research that we built. It's something that's very, very, you have to be very careful that you're doing, whatever way you communicate it and how it's intentioned.
Gavin, just to ask, how would you advocate for neutrality in a for-profit institution?
That's a $1 million question.
I'm curious. Because there's always a mission, right? Especially with product-driven research, right? It's often focused on validation of existing beliefs for a product roadmap that they're hoping to carry out.
It's funny because my initial gut reaction would be to say, because we are the voice of the users. But then on the other side would also say, but we are also the voice of the users. To which I would respond, well, I guess we're both. And that's not really an easy answer for me to say. So I don't actually have a very firm or really easy answer to that question. And it's something that I think where I'm still learning to think about how. I think for me, I think this also touches a little bit on the belief of like ethics within design and within research. To what degree do we believe that this is infringing upon, say, for example, like, users' data or users' protections of privacies? If I see something like that, should I stand up? Will this go against me? What do I do in that case? And that's something I think I've had to struggle and think about. And there are definitely bleaker moments where I'm like, yes, I care about this, but how much of my organization actually care about me caring about this? I think in some ways, like, I would say the best answer for me would say, yes, I'm going to be the best that I can in terms of what I believe in. And if I die on the hill, I guess it's worth dying on. But at the same time, I think we also have to be practical in some cases and also speak for others, because I'm not sure everyone's going to want to do that either. So we have to be practical in terms of how we deliver that message and being careful about that.
I was wanting to add in that usually as researchers, we don't even have a choice in the matter of what gets added in or like what gets selected to push forward or anything. So I mean, like, I haven't really experienced like a full-blown startup, maybe there, but from my experience, everything's always recommendations. And, you know, even as researchers, we still are kind of obligated to say, hey, there might be a problem here, whether it's social acceptability of data usage or whether it's the way people are getting phone calls because of a lead generating side of things, like in a financial side. But you as researchers, yes, I do agree with Gavin. We still have to not only be cognizant, but just basically advocate for the user and saying like, hey, this is what they don't like. It's in writing, here it is. And then I guess if it's a product driven company, then they're going to do with what they want with it. And yeah, I still believe wholeheartedly that it's up to us to at least say something, to speak up about it.
I love how you guys are kind of weighing in on communication skills being super important for a UXR or UXD role, because you have to really communicate and be that voice of your user at that table. So it's really nice to hear from that perspective. If someone was looking to learn more about how to bring that voice to the table, what kind of books would you recommend to them, or podcasts in the UX space? How do they expand their knowledge when it comes to UX? Like, how do I keep learning with UX even beyond school? I'm going to ask Olivia to take this away.
So books to help you within an industry setting for UX? Okay. Yeah, some of my favorite books, I would say The Shape of Design by Frank Chamero. It's a book, very short, maybe 70 pages. Anyone can read it, but it really, I found it was just really, it almost reminded me of like a meditation book, the way that it's written. It's very beautiful. It really talks about the different roles that design can play in people's lives. It's actually very general. It's not specific at all, but The Shape of Design, if you haven't read it, it's really, it's a thoughtful book, and it made me even more inspired to be a designer. The second one I would say is a book by Mike Monteiro, and it's called Ruined by Design. So How Designers Destroyed the World. And Mike Monteiro, he's a consultant that he's out of San Francisco. His company is Mule Design, I think, but he does a lot of UX workshops, as well as presentations on how to be a good presenter and things like this for designers. And the book is based on the responsibilities of designers just today, and the sort of ways that we can be more ethical in our practices, even when operating in for-profit companies, and the things that we can do on a day-to-day basis. So I would definitely recommend that one. And I know a couple of design execs who also just really like Mike Monteiro, so it could be a good way to kind of have a different perspective than just like Don Norman, who is great, but he's kind of the classic go-to. And if you're going to say Don Norman, either of you, he's great. I just sorry.
I'm going to ask Gavin to take away the next one.
I was going to go with the more like textbooky kind of answer, I guess. I actually agree with I really like Mike Monteiro. Like, I think he's really awesome. And yeah, I was really inspired by him. The other thing I would also look up is also not really a book, but a website, I guess. And it's like Tristan Harris. He talks about like, ethics within design and kind of like more like within the tech world itself. So if you're coming from the design ethicist kind of perspective, he's very interesting as well too. For me though, the one book that I started about thinking for research, and I should comment on that, is there really aren't really schools specifically for like researchers. I feel like a lot of boot camps and universities churn out designers who could then, or human factors who then become researchers, which I think is kind of interesting. So it's notable that in terms of that space, it's not a very large one. But for me, in terms of reading, I thought Observing the User Experience by Elizabeth Goodman and Mike Konevsky and Andrea Mode is really good. So Observing the User Experience, it's a pretty cool book. Just kind of gives you the grounding in terms of like the basics of being a user experience researcher, just kind of thinking about how to make a schedule, how to communicate, what are the different kind of research methods you should use. So just a very nice, simple grounding of what to do when you just kind of start. Other things, I really recently liked the service design pairing book. Like you have both of these two together. This is service design this is service design thinking, kind of the more exploratory generative type work. Kind of relates a lot to what we're doing in terms of the methods that we use, but along more in terms of service design. But yeah, I really enjoy those two books for me. Yeah, I think those are the two I kind of focus on right now that I really like.
Yeah, I think naturally I listen to audio more than reading, just because that's just how I consume mostly. But yeah, it's like Laws of UX was one, 100 Things. I think it was 100 Things was another. But those are basically just research related content per se. But if like wanting to like understand like problem spaces in the UX industry, or like some internal like I guess like internal battles that any professional would, I guess, run into, I tend to listen a lot to Jake and Jonathan podcast, and user defenders as another, or just like see whatever is on LinkedIn. I follow a lot of people on LinkedIn, and you see a lot of people just out there talking about the problems in the UX space. So and really like combining all those various sources, you can briefly generate a good understanding of the space currently. As for the communication side, it's kind of interesting you mentioned that, because I don't know much of content to look for communication, but I know internally, like we have courses at Facebook of like learning how to have those difficult conversations, and that's a really good skill to have as well, especially as a researcher or a designer, because a lot of the times you are having difficult conversations with stakeholders, whether it's like saying no to a project, or pivoting because of bandwidth, or or even defending your design decisions or your research findings. So if anything, communication wise, it would be basically anything you could get your hands on when it comes to having difficult conversations, and how to be able to successfully get through them at the end of it. But yeah.
Awesome. I feel like when it comes to design and comes to research, when it comes to UX, you need to learn so much in the classroom, but then when you get out there, how do you really bring that voice to the table? And I feel like you can only learn that from industry professionals like yourself. So thank you so much. I do want you guys to know you're doing great. And I see Gavin's hand over there. So what would you like to say?
Oh, I just want to point out regarding the UX professionals, and Marvin, you were mentioning listening to people on audio podcasts. One of my favorites, actually, when I first started, and I still listen every now and then, is Steve Portigal's Dollars and Donuts. If you haven't heard of it, he talks to a lot of, UX researcher professionals, especially those more in the senior positions, kind of ask them the backstory, how they got into it, what they're hiring for, especially if you're a student. And I was a student at one point, I think just listening to them talk about the lingo and how they went through their backgrounds and how they approach things. And even simple questions like, what are you looking for when you hire? What's your research process like? What's your method in terms of your work? Those are really fun to look to. So I highly recommend that podcast.
I was going to add in too, there's also, I think, Swipe to Unlock that actually opens your eyes to how businesses monetize, which it would be good if you're intending to be a product designer as well, because having an understanding of the monetization of platforms, and it's an important skill to have as well.
I did not think about that pivot when it comes to like potentially going from UX to product design. I'm wondering, like, from another perspective, when you guys got into the industry, what were your trends for career growth? What were you thinking about in terms of where your career would grow? And like, is there anything you know now about your career that you wish you knew back then when you started?
I would say if you have the luxury of time to be picky with where you get to work, don't leap on your first opportunity. I did not have that luxury of time when I first started, and it led me into a position that had quite an immature design practice that impacted my first experience as a product designer quite negatively. So I would say if you're doing co-op, try and ensure that the companies that you're applying to and eventually are paired with are ones that you can really see yourself at once you finish your degree, if you're given the option to come back full time. It's really important to make those connections, I would say, with co-op if that's what you're intending to do. Yeah, I think that's the main thing, is that it's such a competitive space. So obviously it feels like, oh, I got to take this job because I was offered it. And there's a lot of stress, I think, with trying to find work. But like I said, if you do have a little bit of luxury of time, do wait to find something that suits you well, because you will be happier in the end in that role.
Yeah, understanding what's going to make you happy is definitely, I would wish to have told myself earlier, because I totally agree with Olivia. If you like just jump in because you got a role, you can get it will get you closer to burnout in some sense, because you just end up not liking the space you're in. So if anything, wholeheartedly study the job description and get a good understanding of what that role is, even through the interviews, and not expect just because it says UX designer or product designer or design researcher or whatnot that it's going to be the same across the board. It's very diverse. That name is used extremely diversely and loosely in industry. So it definitely be very meticulous about the role that you apply for and get a good understanding if you're going to be happy there, because you may end up not liking it, and then you're going to attribute that not liking the role to it being the industry overall, when it really is just the role that you're in and it's not the whole industry. So but yeah.
I like that point you made about burnout, because a lot of our conversations from past UX researchers and in our class conversations have been about burnout, imposter syndrome, and how when you first start your role, you literally don't feel like you belong in that space. So if you guys have any insights you want to expand on burnout, imposter syndrome in that respect, and how a student's going to have to grapple with that in the near future, please do.
I guess I can relate this to the previous and last in the current question, and that is, I remember one of the first things when I first did graduate school, one of my professors told me, it's still a very valuable lesson, I think, And she said, Gavin, you're entering a space. This is actually in a different space, which is my previous career. It was actually in politics, but she was like, Gavin, you're entering a space where the people you're going to meet, the students that are here, are going to be possibly your colleagues, your friends in the space for maybe the next 10 years, decade, or whatever. So you shouldn't see them as your competitors. It is a very competitive space, granted, but you're going to also want to learn from them, to lean on them for support. And in some cases, you're often going to be friends with them, even best friends. So I remember we had this moment when I was in grad school, and I was like, it felt like we're all competing for the same jobs. And I remember talking to my friends saying like, hey, I know we're competing for the same jobs right now, but that's a short term. I think in the long term, we're all going to be fine. So let's try and help each other and support each other. And that is going to also be helpful for your mental well-being in the future as well, too. You can share that burden together and not feel that you're enemies or you're competing for the same thing. And that's also in itself very stressful. So I would say, treat those around you as allies and not enemies.
I really appreciate that note, because I find that at least going to a bigger university, you're always told to compete. You're just a number and you just have to keep going. And, that whole mindset of knowing that you have friends in the industry and you have people you can learn from within your cohort is super valuable and important. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm gonna slightly shift gears because we are getting to our last final questions. Students really want to know, what the heck do we put in our portfolios as we're applying to these jobs? What do you want to see if you're looking at our portfolio for those 1 or 2 minutes? How can we really make ourselves stand out?
I'm just gonna be upfront and say I haven't judged anyone's portfolio that led to someone being hired at any role or any capacity in industry, but at least what has worked for me in the past is just the way you brand yourself, and like having, especially if you're going to say you're a researcher and you're a designer, your portfolio better show it in a way of you have the hierarchy, it's easy to use, and there's consistency to it. But overall, what to put in it, I think that's a hot debate, period. I mean, how many projects should you put? Like, some people say a lot. I've mostly heard 3 or 4 of quality, but ideally what you would want to put is the works that you've made the most impact, and that you're most proud of, and that doesn't necessarily have to be, it's professional work, like industry related. It could be anything, even if it's a passion project. But the whole point of a portfolio anyways is to communicate your process. So making sure that is cut and clear, like what was your role, how much time it took to get from A to Z, and the methodologies, and it just being clear and concise, and with just the right visuals. But yeah, as for what to put in a portfolio, it's really subjective. What is they have done in the past and what's important to them. But I think the most important thing would be the branding, if I would say anything, because that's just, unfortunately, that's what recruiters will see and will judge you firsthand. Does this person brand themselves in a specific way? But yeah.
I guess I'll go next. I think I've been guilty, and everyone has been guilty of this, and that is, you've gone through your portfolio like a zillion times. You've changed every single, case study. Like, you've written at least 4 or 5 times. You changed the font, you changed the cover page, you've experimented with different things, and you're like, what the heck is the right format? What's going to stand out? A couple answers to that, I guess, is like, if your cover page should be something that's eye-catching. Think of it like a front page of a novel. What is it that's going to symbolize to you? Maybe one example I heard from a friend is your resume. If, like, say you had like one blurb about you and it was your gravestone, how would you summarize yourself? What would it say about you that would jump out to that person? something that's not entirely like monotonely bland, like, I'm a researcher who loves to do quantitative research and I study this, this, and this. And it's like, okay, well, what else about you that makes you human too, as a person and not just a researcher? What is it that's unique about you in a certain sense? That's kind of candid. I think another thing too is also think about your portfolio also as a portion of you. Like, it's that person is communicating to someone else. And the best analogy I can give is I once went into an interview with a portfolio, as in like an actual like PowerPoint portfolio, and it was 42 pages. I didn't get the job, but I went to the second interview, and my friend, fortunately, the designer, looked at it and he was like, "Gavin, what is this?" And I was like, "It's my portfolio." He's like, "It's way too detailed. You think they're going to read this entire thing?" And I'm like, "You're probably right." So before the interview, the night before, I sliced the thing down from like 40 something pages down to like 12 or 13. And I got the role. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, think about who you're communicating to in terms of your audience. Who are they? What are they expecting? How are you going to talk to them at their level? Then maybe they're a designer, maybe they're a design manager, maybe they're a research manager, but whoever it is, think about the medium, the environment, and the space of what you're trying to communicate and how it's going to be appropriate. Most people, when they look at your resume online, a portfolio online, they might even just look for 3 seconds. That's all you have. Think about that first impression. It really matters.
I agree with Gavin. It's really important to communicate who your audience is. I find most portfolios to be extremely boring. I find they're canned. You get the research questions, who is on your team, and then it leads into the process. And it's fine. It's good to have one of those, but I find them pretty uninspiring because they're often just copying each other. It will be this one great designer who ended up getting a job at Google or some kind of big reputable company, and then everyone will kind of model their portfolio off those individuals. And I think that's, at least for me, that's not the way to kind of go forward. I would really kind of, the way when I apply to jobs, I think of, if from an executive perspective, what does this person care about? And then based on the department that I'm applying to, what is their responsibility in actioning on whatever that main mission is of the company? Because then you're also tapping into the overall strategy and purpose of why that organization exists to begin with. The other thing I would say is, there's within the iSchool, there's a tendency just to focus on users, which isn't reflective of working on a product team, which is a mixture of business and tech as well. So if you are applying to product roles, think about how you are considering business and tech perspectives in the projects that you're putting forward. So how can you balance out some kind of prioritization of ideas that you're putting forward? Or if from a tech requirement perspective, if that's something you're interested in doing, how can you somehow bring those requirements around the types of research decisions or design decisions that you end up implementing? And I think that could really give you a competitive edge, because that's often not considered in portfolios. If you don't want product design and are more interested from a government perspective, I'm sure there's other angles that you could take to really showcase your specific interest and development in areas that are outside of just design and research.
I'm just going to add to that as well. I like how you mentioned that a lot of things tend to be canned. And I think we have to think about things about communicating. And I think as designers and researchers, we're also storytellers, and we should never forget that. Our job is to communicate sophisticated, often very complex problems. And if we cannot communicate that in the first place to other people, we more or less failed at our jobs, even if the research is good or correct or rigorous. We are often the bottleneck of that kind of medium. And so communication is very, very key. We have to be able to tell a story. We have to be able to weave it in a way that people can understand. People need to go understand what we're telling them.
Just kind of building off that storytelling piece. we are on to our final question. I can't believe we got here so fast. I'm going to ask you guys to tell me a story. Imagine it's your first day in school in a UX program or human factors, and you got to go back and give your old self one piece of advice when you started your trajectory in your career. What would that be? And what would you say to your old self?
I think I would have focused less on what I think organizations expect me to do and more on my natural interests and abilities. There's a balance there because I kind of flipping what I just said, right? Because I did say to focus more on business and tech, which for me, I'm really glad that I learned those pieces, and they will make me a better designer, and they make me better even within a PhD context now. I think, though, I push myself a little bit too heavily within a direction of what I thought was required to succeed in what I thought was a UX design role. And I had to kind of correct myself because I was really just thinking of all the boxes I needed to check to get a job. And it turned out that a lot of, or many of those boxes were things that I wasn't actually interested in doing. But you can kind of get blindsided around what you think is required to get a role. And now that I've kind of seen both sides, I'm pretty confident that if you do follow your interests, and obviously that doesn't mean you shouldn't push yourself, you should, you will end up succeeding, maybe not on exactly the path that you thought, but I would recommend that.
Yeah, I kind of would second that. And when I started my human factors program, it was because I experienced burnout as a musician, and like just spending countless hours in a practice room. I was like, I don't think this is going to be for me. But at the same time, I kind of transferred that over into my when I started learning about UX in grad school. Is I overworked too hard to check those boxes, as Olivia said, and really, like, yes, you should work hard, but you shouldn't have this defined notion of what UX is and what a UX researcher or designer to get that role, because you don't know what's going to happen. So you just can only focus on you and do your best. And if I were to tell myself and go back, it would be just that you're doing everything you can. I mean, you're going to school, you're creating that portfolio, you're putting your foot out there, you're getting that exposure. That's really all you can do, and just don't blame yourself for it if it doesn't go the way you defined it had to go. Yeah.
I'm gonna add to what Marvin is saying and Olivia is saying, and that is one of the first things I remember the first month actually of school was that the mantra of fail fast and fail often. And I think especially it applies from the academic sense of we often go to school, especially if you come from like a real academic background, maybe a social sciences and whatnot, used to writing papers, used to conjecture, used to doing things like once and that's it. You hand in a paper, you're done, you're finished. You don't really iterate on something, at least until you go to maybe like grad school, you start working in design in that regard. So there's this conceived notion when you're in school of just you do one thing right, you get a grade, that's it. But then, when you get into industry, you start to realize, there's actually many ways to succeed. You don't always succeed the first time, and even that applies to just your career arc as a whole. Maybe you start as a product designer, maybe you start as a researcher, but you could always end up being something different too. And I think, we're all evidence that, there's always life after a certain career. You can always move into something else. Don't think that this is what I have to be right now, that I have to fit this for the regard of an arc and then do it and then fit it. You have to be flexible to failure, and that's how you're going to grow in your career and as a person, I think, as a whole, no matter what. So you have to be cognizant of that change, not be afraid of it.
So what I'm kind of hearing from you guys is own your failures, know yourself and kind of keep moving forward as you go. Is there anything else I should be kind of taking in from your past self, what you would say to your younger self?
Have fun.
Have
It's
fun.
supposed to be fun. If you're not having fun, then you're probably doing it wrong. Just kidding.
No, I think that's true. I think we need to have more fun along the way. I've heard from a lot of people that they would tell their past selves to be less serious when life goes on. So I don't know if you guys would emulate that, but yeah. Well, we are at the end of our time for today. I wanted to thank you all so much for your insights. I'm sure many students, including myself, have learned so much from this conversation. We'll find real value in your knowledge that you shared here today, and we're so grateful for your time. Thank you so much, and maybe we'll see you back here one day again too. Take care.